like to give a warm welcome to our first keynote speaker. We're happy to bring Chief Security and Trust Officer from Cylance, Mr. Malcolm Harkins. So Malcolm, come on up and we'll get you started.
Thank you. See if you guys hear me? Is the mic on? All right. Let me, is that better? You guys can hear me? All right, cool, perfect, thanks. So let me give you a little bit of background about myself because it frames some of this discussion. As was mentioned, I'm Chief Security and Trust Officer with Cylance Corporation, but I'm an oddball in this space, complete oddball. I've got an undergraduate in economics, an MBA in finance accounting. I'm not a technologist. But the other thing that makes me a little bit different than probably many of you in the crowd and many of my peers is I've also only worked for 2 companies in 28 years. I worked for Intel Corporation for 24 years, and then Cylance now for 3.5. And the first 10, 11, 12 years of my career at Intel, I was in procurement, finance, business operations. And I didn't intend to go into security. I tripped my way into security after Code Red 9/11, and Andy Grove was still running Intel, and like his book, Only the Paranoid Survive, he was frankly beating the shit out of the CIO to deal with the availability risk issues. And the CIO called me up and says, Malcolm, I need you to run security and business continuity for me. I was like, why? I don't know shit about security. He goes, that's fine, I got a bunch of security geeks who don't know shit about the business. They'll teach you, you'll teach them. I've never left the space, and that's been 17 plus years. So what you'll hear in my talk today is perspective from that background, perspective from my time. And my last role at Intel after I had tripped my way into security, over that 14, 15 years that I ran it at security, I ended up owning product security, not the features for sale, but the security development lifecycle and product privacy by design for its products and services. I ran all aspects of information risk and security for IT and the extended enterprise, but I also ran corporate emergency management, had physical security report to me. So I had a broad role in a very large company. I'm going to start with this video, if you can tee that up and start playing it. So growing up at the heart of computing, where the foundation of computing lays, I always believed, because of where I grew up in my early 20s, of the power and the potential for computing to connect and enrich lives, create social and economic benefit for organizations, for countries, for people. And so for me, computing is about that. And so therefore, why does security exist? Security exists to protect, to enable that. And you can see in this video from the Isabella project from eNable, this girl who's getting a prosthetic device. She was born without an arm from basically the elbow down. And if you think of the way in which prosthetic devices have been created over years, they cost tens of thousands of dollars. They take months and months of tooling and machining. They take measurements and measurements and measurements. And what you see here is a plastic prosthetic device that was made in the course of a couple weeks. It was made possible because of affordable CAD computing, a laptop, cloud, collaboration, and 3D printing. See the smile on her face. This would not have been possible without computing. The traditional way, by the time she probably would have gotten the prosthetic device, she would have grown enough it wouldn't have fit. The price point for this is hundreds of dollars. And you can see how it can affect and change a life and the joy that she gets out of it. So when you think about your jobs and you think about why information security exists, why controls exist for computing, keep those type of things in mind, because for me, that's really what it's all about. And when you think about it and where we're at today, information risk and information security is basically a trust problem. And I'll be really, really blunt, and I work in the tech industry, I work in the security industry. By and large, you cannot trust the security industry. I'll say it again. By and large, you cannot trust the security industry. And I'll explain why with this as well as I go forward. Trust is a function of 2 things, competence and character. Competencies are the results you deliver, the outcomes you deliver to the business. All we've got to do is look at the news day in and day out about the unmanaged, unmitigated, unchecked risk.
And yet we've spent billions and billions of dollars on solutions that haven't adequately managed that risk for us. So from a competency perspective, the security industry has not delivered on the results that our organizations and our businesses need. And then when it gets to character, the security industry profits from the insecurity of computing. Again, I'll say it again. The security industry profits from the insecurity of computing. So when you think about it from an intent, the vast majority of the vendors in the industry have no economic incentive to solve the problem. So by and large, we have a trust issue with the industry that we're a part of, with the industry that is supposed to serve us, that by and large hasn't. ISSA LA, I speak at their events pretty routinely. A little over a year and a half ago, I was on a panel in front of an audience, and there was 4 or 5 of us on this panel, and a question was asked, and we all gave our answers, and one of my peers, one of our peers, ended their answer, well, we've just got to accept it, they're going to get in. Now, these type of statements, frankly, piss me off. I don't go into work every day accepting defeat. My job is to do my damn best to manage and mitigate those risks. And so I frankly verbally gutted that individual in front of the audience for failing to do their job. And what made it more appalling was that was the CISO for a security company focused on identity and authentication. And I basically said, you just told your customers and potential customers in this room that you've given up and given in. You've accepted the equivalent of digital assault on your company, on your shareholders, and on your customers. How dare you do that? But that's the world we've lived in. That's what we've gotten used to. This is the message that the industry would like us to believe. RSA, how many of you go to RSA? A good number of you. February of 2017, register in Moscone West, walk out to Moscone, looking out at Moscone North. These 4 big billboards. Trademark statement, the moment you link business risk to a security incident, that's business-driven security. That's complete and utter bullshit, folks. I've managed risk and security for a very long time. An idiot could link a security incident with any material impact or significance to the business. The only way in which this is business-driven security is to drive the business of the security industry who profits from our continued insecurity. The marketing machine of the industry wants to keep us in this cycle, keep us an industry in motion without making forward progress, getting us to think that compromise is okay. RSA 2018 this year, the theme was now matters. Okay, that's great, but now has always mattered. Why? Because risk is temporal. The decisions I make today affect risk a week from now, a day from now, a year from now, 10 years from now, or in things like Meltdown and Spectre, 20 years later. So now always matters. Now, as you can probably guess, because I get fairly irritated with certain things, Keynote for RSA this year. And again, it was a great keynote, but there were some elements that, again, frankly, pissed me off. The big idea here was a 1% improvement everywhere. How is that going to fundamentally change the curve that we're on when risk has been growing exponentially? And if you can look at the key messages here, get a little better every day. Well, I agree we should all do that. But unless we transformationally change what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how we're doing it, we're going to continue in the cycle we've seen for a couple decades now. Again, if a vulnerability has been exploited in the wild, let's patch it. Well, again, that's a reactive strategy. Why not stop the vulnerability at the beginning of the cycle? Have a better security development life cycle. Privacy by design. Why not have better solutions that don't keep me on this perpetual treadmill of having to do emergency patches? Now, the first time I did this talk was about a year ago, and I started stepping back and thinking, because I hear from a lot of peers, and there's a bunch of them that are incredibly smart, as well as all of you, and this whole notion of accepting compromise. And I went to my wife, who has her PhD in developmental psychology and emotion behavior research in early childhood. And I said, you know, I'm getting irritated with the fact that people are accepting compromise. And so I started going, what is it about the fact that these are smart people that accept it? Have we become habituated to compromise? And so I asked her about what causes us to form habits, and then I had this idea of monkeys and malware because she pointed me to some animal research around how habits are formed. And again, what I came to realize is that, you know, at first we make our habits and then our habits make us. And again, are we habituated to compromise, therefore accept it? There's a famous experiment. Now, this is actually a little bit more of a fable, but it does have some basis in research from the 1920s and 1960s. But this fable that's on the internet that I think is an interesting analogy is there's 5 monkeys in a cage. And in the middle of the cage, there's a ladder with a banana on top. And every time a monkey goes up to get the banana, you know, something that's nutritious, good, the other monkeys in the cage get doused with water. And after a time or two of doing that, anytime a monkey went up to go get the banana, the other monkeys would drag it down and beat it up. And in this fable, they run the scenario multiple times, and then they start switching out the monkeys with new monkeys, and then they stop dousing the monkeys with water. But still what happens is every time a monkey goes up the ladder, the other monkeys pull him down and beat him up. And I go, do we do that to ourselves? Do we hold each other back from transformational thinking and accepting the status quo? Do our organizations, when we say have a better approach, again, get into this industry narrative? Well, we can't stop them. So why would we invest in that? Why would we do something different? We should just be mopping up the mess a little quicker. And so I found this interesting because I do actually think in many ways we do hold ourselves back. You know, as a CISO, I know I did that a few times with my team at Intel. It's like, why would we go do that? You know, I don't know that that's going to make sense. Rather than having an open mind to the potential for something better. And so when you think about it, incremental change, again, that 1% improvement everywhere, which we need to do continuous improvement. Fully agree with that. But that's a step-by-step variation in something that we already know, something that we're already comfortable with. It's a part of the established continuum of what we've been doing, right? It's things that we need to do day in and day out, but that's not going to make a significant difference in the risk curves we've been seeing. And again, it's based upon precedent, and it's intended basically to do more of the same, just a little bit better. Again, that 1% improvement everywhere, right? Not a bad idea, but is it the right idea? I don't think so. But transformational change, it's a discontinuity from the system we're used to. It's a reconceptualization of how we've been approaching things. It's transformational. It's step functions forward. It's a leap ahead versus an incremental step ahead. But the difference in this for all of us and psychologically and for businesses is that it creates resistance because it's a fear of separation from what we know. And there's a bit of a fear of failure in creating that leap. Right, and we see it in businesses day in, day out. Think of what's happened to Blockbuster. It's no longer around. Is that because they were afraid of something transformational like streaming movies versus having a fixed function store? Again, we can see those type of discontinuities, and those who have failed to take the transformational change fall behind. And I think that we have to remember for ourselves. We will fall behind serving our companies and our organizations unless we take that leap ahead, unless we do that transformational change. So more on today's reality. ISSA, again, they've published these studies. This one's from a year or two ago. When they survey us, we basically say our organizations are either somewhat vulnerable or significantly vulnerable, which means we're 100% vulnerable. What are our jobs other than managing the vulnerability? And we basically just said we can't do it. Why not? World Economic Forum, I read their stuff all the time and I love it. If you haven't read it, their risk report comes out every February going into the World Economic Forum in Davos. The past few years, in the top 5 risks for the world across everything, multiple countries, social economic divides, cyber risk is in the top 5. It was the #1 business risk in 2018. And it's alongside things like climate change, income disparity. I've said for a long time, and in my second book, I published an entire chapter around thinking about information risk as a social responsibility. It is becoming and has become a societal risk. We crossed the tipping point a few years ago where anything and everything with power is becoming IP addressable. It's connecting, it's communicating, it's computing. And therefore, we've created a societal risk. And it's our job to manage that. Some more data. Edelman Trust Report, again, comes out about the same time as the World Economic Forum. Across multiple countries, again, social economic divides, there's been an implosion of trust. 2/3 of the world are distrusters. Again, the comments here, we're at treacherous seas without a firm mooring. They're saying that for the world in terms of the risks and the polarization of society that we're seeing. I think we have the same issue in the cyber industry. Europol, again, fantastic data. And their 2018 report just came out a couple of weeks ago, and it basically says the same thing. Acceleration of previous trends, we've all seen that, which means we're not doing a good job of managing and mitigating the risk. APT, nation-state actors and cybercrime boundaries blurring. I've seen that for a long time, duh. But the thing that is actually most interesting to me with all the research they do on all the internet crimes in Europe, they say the majority of the attacks are neither sophisticated or advanced. So why is it every time we see a news article that says somebody was breached, the headline reads, "A sophisticated actor"? It's a rinse, reuse, recycle, repeat cycle. Yeah, there's some sophisticated things, but getting a user to click on shit isn't that sophisticated. How many of you guys have phishing stuff for your employees? Probably everybody. How many of you have like a 3 strikes law? You click on the test, you fail, you get a written warning, stuff like that? Couple folks. I know some peers that do that. And I go, "Are you going to fire your CEO?" And then they get appalled and they go, "Well, no." It's like, so you're going to fire somebody who's making $30,000 a year for getting an email that looked like it came from its boss, saying attention immediately, and it looked like it came from an internal email, and everything else is perfect? I go, when a user clicks on something and something goes wrong, that's a failure in technology to protect them, protect the company, protect the systems. That's not a failure in the user. Now, if a user gets a phish and then gives up their credentials because they panic and they don't realize it, yeah, that's a user issue. But when a user plugs in something into their device, clicks on something, goes to a website that's a legitimate website that has a cross-site scripting vulnerability error and it's been owned and then malicious code injects on their system, that's a technology failure. And we shouldn't be blaming the users for doing their job. How do you use a computer unless you're clicking on stuff? You can't. When I wrote my second book, I had started from a basis of things that I realized when I came into this space 17 years ago when I was frankly getting the crap beat out of me by Andy Grove and a bunch of Intel executives. And I go, what do they need me to deliver? What are the business outcomes that Intel shareholders expect of me? They expect me to work on 3 planes of business outcomes: risk, cost, and a notion of what I call control friction. And again, it continued to frustrate me, this notion of protection. What does that mean? And so I created this framework to kind of up-level the dialogue, and it's stuff that I think we all realize, but we fail to sometimes simplify when we think of our control philosophies and when we communicate internally to our directors and others in the internal audience. There's 3 primary control types for physical risk, logical risk, almost any risk. You can prevent risk, detect it, and respond to it, right? But as you go from prevention to response, risk grows. A little bit of a duh, but we sometimes forget that. And then there's 3 macro ways you can approach controls in an automated, semi-automated, and manual fashion. Now, being a finance guy, automation is the cheapest. And as you go to manual, it's the most expensive. So cost grows as you go from automated to manual. Now, where we are at as an industry is we've been stuck in the semi-automated to manual detection and response space, which is the highest cost, highest risk, most liable spot. And you go, why is that? Well, if it's the highest cost to me as an organization, guess what? That's the biggest revenue for the industry. Getting back to my economic incentives for the industry. The more pain and suffering I have, the more money the industry makes. So why are we stuck in this treadmill? Leaders can distinguish motion from progress. We've been an industry in motion with very little progress. Now again, there's this 3rd dimension of control friction. Now controls are a drag coefficient on people, data, business processes. They chew up unnecessary compute cycles. In a high control friction environment, what happens? How many of you have your users say, that security control enabled me to get my job done? Right, nobody, right? They bitch and moan about the security controls getting in the way. And in those environments, what happens? One of 2 things. In a rigid organization, they'll follow the control. And what happens then? You've slowed down the business. And if you slow down the business, you've just added cost, you've lost market opportunities, and that actually can have a long-term effect on the organization. Now, in most of the organizations that I've worked for, and I think many of you probably do the same, in a high control friction environment, when the controls get in the way of the user, what does the user do? They go around the control, right? And guess what? Does the security industry have an incentive to deal with control friction? No. Because if your end user and business goes around the control, guess what? The security industry is there to sell you another tool to monitor your users, block them from putting stuff on a USB, whatever the case. So again, going back to the fact that the industry doesn't necessarily have the economic incentive to help us solve the problem. I've long believed, again, being an economist, that information security is an economic inefficiency. It's a byproduct of vulnerabilities left in technology, sometimes because of sloppy design and validation, sometimes just because you can't eliminate risk, right? And those vulnerabilities get exploited out of mistake or intent. But when people challenge me on that, I go, let's go to the definition of what is an economic efficiency. And an economic efficiency is where every resource is optimally allocated to serve while minimizing waste. How much waste have we created? Spending on information security doesn't add to the net income of our businesses. It adds to the net income of the security industry. The ideal state is where the welfare of the population is at its highest level. Are we at the highest level of safety and welfare for the population at large? No. So by the definition of the fact that we're not an economic efficiency, we're an economic inefficiency. And if we approach it from an economic mindset, we will think about it a little bit differently. But the reality is it's our approach to information security that's causing that economic inefficiency. And today's CISO reality is, again, that transformational change, it's been impeded by the mind traps that we're in that maintain our behaviors in the patterns that we've been habituated to. I was in Australia in March, and I was doing a kind of Chatham House Rules dinner with some CISOs, some CIOs, some CEOs, a few folks in the government in Australia. And one of the folks who worked for a political candidate there, after we had started a little bit of dialogue, said, hey, can we step back a second? What do you think your role is? How would you define your role as a chief security officer, chief information security officer? And I said, you know, I'm a choice architect. I'm architecting choices for the business. Some of those choices I get to make. Some of them the CIO gets to make. Some of them a business unit leader gets to make. Some of them the board gets to make. But in essence, I'm a choice architect, just like I was when I was a finance guy. I'm making choices, and those choices are behaviors. And so we've got to think about that as we approach these things and how we frame the discussions and dialogues in our organizations. You know, again, the reality is the threat actors and threat agents have had this massive temporal advantage over us. Why? Because everything's reactive. We have to have a victim. And then we have to understand what happened. And then we go about driving attribution to threat actors and threat agents, nation state, organized crime. You know, the equation we're all used to, risk is a function of threat, vulnerability, consequence. I have no ability to affect the threat actor and threat agent. Maybe a minor level on insider risk and a couple other things. But by and large, I can't affect the threat actor and threat agent. Consequence and impact is what it is based upon my dependency on technology. The only controllable variable I have is how vulnerable I am. And again, from the own ISSA data, we say we're completely vulnerable. So what the hell are we doing if we're not managing that? Some data to prove my point on the economic incentive of the industry. Piper Jaffray, the brokerage and financial services firm, 2 years ago, they did a long macroeconomic study. 74.1% correlation between breach activity, meaning harm to a company, an organization, its shareholders, its customers, and industry revenue growth. The more harm that gets created, the more the industry revenue grows. Other data from last year with WannaCry. Cybersecurity stocks boom. The market cap of the 5 biggest cybersecurity companies grew by billions of dollars. And guess what? When their customers were owned. So how stupid are we to buy more shit from people who sold us crap that didn't work to protect us? To drive their stock up and fuel the economic incentive of continued compromise. Shame on us. What should have happened and what would have happened in a regular industry is their stocks should have plummeted because they failed to do their job. Again, being an economist, I read a lot of economic studies. Harvard, every couple of years, puts out a study on the state of US competitiveness. Michael Porter, anybody who's heard of him, he teaches at Harvard, does competitive models and stuff. But it was interesting when I read it a couple years ago that they talked about what was at that time, and again, we've had some changes obviously economically with some of the tax incentives and a few things. So things have shifted, but that's because of stimulus, not necessarily fundamentals. That the economic challenges that the US face are structural. Again, when you think about it from an information security industry, again, I think we have structural challenges. Divisive political rhetoric, not like we've seen any of that the past couple of years, but uninformed national debate has confused the average American. Again, are we doing that as an industry? Is the marketing machinery of the security industry creating an uninformed debate in our organizations and for our executives? I tend to think so. There's a disconnect between reality of what's causing our problems and what to do about it. Again, I think we've got the same thing in the security industry. And again, there's a misunderstanding of the facts that can be dangerous. So how do you achieve an economic efficiency? You have a control philosophy that not only drives incremental change, but transformational change. We have to get into a pattern of understanding, instead of who did it or why they did it, how did it occur? How was that breach successful? What controlled failed? I was talking to the Federal Trade Commission back here a few weeks ago, and they were asking me things they could do. I said, how about when a breach occurs, we mandate a public disclosure on what control failed and who was responsible for that control and where did we buy it from? Why didn't it work? Hold the security industry accountable to the fact that its solution didn't work. Drive a control philosophy of shifting left to more and more automation to lower cost, pushing down continually because we learn and we figure out how to better prevent these issues going forward. And then pushing in and reducing the control friction. Because that is the business outcome. That is the outcomes that we need to deliver. That is the outcomes the security industry needs to provide to us so that we can enable our organizations to achieve its mission and goals. I like videos and stuff, so why don't we go ahead and play this video here. Again, it's a monkeys thing. Oh, if you guys go back.
So a final experiment that I want to mention to you is our fairness study. And so this became a very famous study, and there's now many more, because after we did this about 10 years ago, it became very well known. And we did that originally with capuchin monkeys, and I'm going to show you the first experiment that we did. It has now been done with dogs, and with birds, and with chimpanzees. But with Sarah Brosnan, we started out with capuchin monkeys. So what we did is we put two capuchin monkeys side by side. Again, these animals, they live in a group. They know each other. We take them out of the group, put them in a test chamber. And there's a very simple task that they need to do. And if you give both of them cucumber for the task, the two monkeys side by side, they're perfectly willing to do this 25 times in a row. So cucumber, even though it's really only water in my opinion, but cucumber is perfectly fine for them. Now, if you give the partner grapes, the food preferences of my capuchin monkeys correspond exactly with the prices in the supermarket. And so if you give them grapes, that's a far better food, then you create inequity between them. So that's the experiment we did. Recently, we videotaped it with new monkeys who had never done the task, thinking that maybe they would have a stronger reaction, and that turned out to be right. The one on the left is the monkey who gets cucumber. The one on the right is the one who gets grapes. The one who gets cucumber, note that the first piece of cucumber is perfectly fine. The first piece she eats. Then she sees the other one getting grape, and you will see what happens. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber, and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber. She tests the rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again. So this is basically the Wall Street protest that you see here.
Now, I love this video. And again, the rocks are a form of payment, right? And you can see the grapes being more sustenance, better for you, better tasting. And what happens when one monkey sees that the other monkey has a grape, not a cucumber? They throw that shit back. I don't want this. And if we did attribution to the control that failed, heck, monkeys can learn the difference between what's good and bad for the same form of payment. We've got to think about it a little bit differently than the way in which we've approached it. Which gets to me, and again, how you frame the problems. We have this notion in almost any type of risk and control organization. I had it when I was in finance, procurement, see it in the information risk industry, whether it be ISSA, ISACA, audits, whatever. This notion of business velocity versus business control. We frame them as opposing things. And when we frame them as opposing things, guess what? They're always going to oppose each other. And so therefore, we're going to say, well, it's control friction or not. It's risk or not. This is an architectural issue. It's a design challenge. It's an innovation problem. I think we all know the story of Ford. 1971, it was facing its stiffest competition in the low-end car market. Volkswagen was coming into the US. Ford designed and manufactured the Pinto in the fastest it had ever done an automobile. It was under a year. And I think we all know what happened, but I've done a lot of work looking at the studies on the ethics and the choices and the behaviors that were made. Lee Iacocca was running the Ford Pinto division at the time. Don't know the man, wasn't there. Again, I've done a lot of research reading some of the studies on this. I really doubt that Lee Iacocca was trying to kill people, but I do believe that the way in which they framed the choice, framed it in profit and loss, framed it in liability, instead of framing it in terms of a human life, caused them to ship that car for several years. Now, they had the patent on an $11 part for a safer gas tank. An $11 part. And those vehicles were what, $2,000 at the time, give or take a little bit maybe? And they failed to implement it. Now, an interesting backstory on this, again in the 70s, some of us are old enough to remember a lot of the radio spots that the auto industry did to promote cars. The advertising agency for Ford, a couple years in as data was mounting, showing there was some, perhaps, correlation between certain impacts and an explosion in cars, the advertising agency pulled a radio spot that they were doing for Ford. The advertisement on the radio ended with a, "Buy a Ford Pinto, it will leave you with that warm feeling inside." An advertising agency recognized the irony in the situation, but Ford didn't for another few years. Again, choices we make. Are we doing this in our design development of technology? Are we doing this in how we operate it? Are we doing it in accepting compromise for our organizations? In 1911, there was the South Pole expedition in October of 1911. Two teams, Amundsen and Scott. They left roughly a couple days apart. They left 10, 15, 20 miles apart, all for the same goal, all for the same purpose, being the first people to plant a flag at the South Pole. Now, what's interesting about this story is there's two significantly different outcomes. Amundsen had a view that victory awaits him who has everything in order, defeat is certain for him who has neglected to take all the necessary precautions in time. Amundsen's team got to the South Pole, planted the flag, got back. Scott's team showed up at the South Pole 30 days later, found the flag, and they all died on the way back. All the necessary precautions in time. Anybody ever read the book Great by Choice? Morton Hansen, Jim Collins? It's a fantastic book. In that book, they evaluate not only the Scott and Amundsen journey, but they evaluate what they call 10Xers, organizations that have had long-term growth and economic success and impact for the world. And what they found through that long-term business and economic and analytical study was 4 key things for the people who made substantial change and impact. They had fanatical discipline, productive paranoia, empirical creativity, limitless ambition. Is it limitless ambition to accept compromise? I don't think so. And again, what they found with Scott and Amundsen, the circumstances were the same. They had roughly the same size teams. They were going to the same destination. They left at roughly the same time. But their behaviors were different. And the behaviors of one led to success and fame. the behaviors of the others, and they all perished. I've got 3 kids, and what I used to always tell my kids, particularly when they got kind of in kindergarten onward, and my 22-year-old, he still has a Post-it note I wrote for him when he was 8 years old on his window in his room. You can't talk your way out of something you behaved your way into. Think about it. We're behaving our way into this problem. We're perpetuating the choices we've made. We have to change our behaviors. We have to change our choices. We have to frame the risk differently in order to fundamentally transform what we're seeing today. I like analogies. Formula One cars. You think about it, they're taking enormous risk. Everything about it is risky. You know, again, I grew up in an organization that talked about speed. How many of you here in your organizations, we need to go faster, right? Speed kills, right? NTSB shows that all the time. Speed kills. What a business needs is velocity. What is velocity? Speed with control, speed with discipline. If it's designed the right way and our controls are designed the right way, the friction won't get in the way of it and will create adherence to the mission, just like a Formula One. The car, the track, everything they do is designed for 2 things, speed and safety. They're getting velocity. The spoiler on the back of the car creates friction. It creates friction to create cohesion for the car on the track. How many of our security controls do that for the missions of our business? Virtually none. And when you think about it from a pit crew, right, the collaboration, the communication they have between the driver and the pit crew is all aiding towards that mission. How often does our security operations center operate in the same way? How often does the SOC actually end up at odds with the IT operations team? That's a design issue. We own it. We can fix it if we frame the issues differently, if we frame the outcomes we need to deliver to our organizations differently. I call it being tuned to target. And we've got to have this notion of its business velocity and control. Yeah, there might be trade-offs we need to make. But if we start with them as opposing forces, they'll always be opposing forces, versus try and figure out how to actually get them aligned towards each other with a common goal. The business isn't going to do that for us. We have to do it for the business. I don't know how many of you know the background story on the creation of the Panama Canal. It's a fascinating story. You know, for decades and decades and decades, many countries had tried to create the Panama Canal and failed over and over again. And then in the late 1800s, the French started building the Panama Canal in 1879. Now, the interesting thing is they had just finished the Suez Canal a couple years earlier. So they figured since they had built the Suez Canal, they could build the Panama Canal. Well, they couldn't. And there was 2 fundamental issues that caused that problem. One, the Suez Canal was built at sea level, so they tried the same approach, the Panama Canal. 200 inches of rain a year was different than building in a desert, wiped away all the work. Now, how safe is that if you're digging a ditch to go back and start digging a ditch and you're deaf? Not very safe for you or anybody else. And so when you think about it, a toxic control, I didn't die, but now I'm deaf. Are our security controls toxic to our user environment, toxic to achieving the business mission and objective? Is it the equivalent of that control friction that I mentioned earlier? I would say yes, it is. Now, what ended up happening, if you fast forward a few decades, Panama declares its independence, US officially creates the Panama Canal Zone, and just in a few short years, the Panama Canal opens. You go, well, what happened? Well, 2 things. Understanding the architectural issue that was a limiting factor, hence move up into the mountains a bit more and creating the lock system. But we still had the problem of malaria. And what ended up happening was Major Ronald Ross in 1904 had discovered that malaria was transmitted by mosquitoes. And so the control of malaria was actually vital to the construction of the Panama Canal. Now, what ended up happening is shortly after that discovery, Colonel Gorges formed a sanitary zone. They went through and said, we need to systematically understand where mosquitoes are breeding in order to control for malaria, in order to not have workers die, in order to not leave them deaf, in order to get the Panama Canal built. Now, what ended up happening was dramatic because they properly controlled for the risk because they understood it. They eradicated yellow fever. The death rate dropped in workers tenfold in about a 3-year period. And the death rate for the entire population of the country of Panama dropped by almost an 8-fold level in a few years. Properly understanding the root cause, the vulnerability that caused malaria, then led to dramatic results, not only in life, but for the world, because now the Panama Canal was able to be built. And think of the economic efficiency that was created, the boom at the turn of the century that occurred because people no longer had to ship around Cape Horn. The dramatic effect that the Panama Canal had on the world from social and economic benefit was enormous. And it was all made possible because people actually understood the risk and understood how to properly control for it. Now, lessons in this for security are pretty simple. Malaria wasn't eliminated. I'm not some person who thinks you can eliminate risk. You can't. We can't eliminate it physically, we can't eliminate it logically. But we can sure do a damn better job than we're doing today. But we have to understand the source of the problem. What control failed? Why did it fail? How do we make not only incremental improvements, but transformational leaps forward to address the vulnerabilities? If we do that, again, I think for computing and all of its potential, we can unleash dramatic worldwide social and economic benefit. We can connect and enrich lives in ways that we're hoping to do, but might be constrained or limited for our failure to properly control for the risks. I like quotes. Michelangelo, the greatest danger for most of us is not that our aim is too high and we miss it, but our aim is too low and we reach it. That's too low, folks. The industry wants us to stay stuck in this cycle. Incremental improvement. Well, yeah, again, we need to do that, but what about transformational change that gets us in front of the risk curve instead of continually reacting to it? This isn't limitless ambition. This is aiming too low and reaching it. We've been doing that for decades, and we've allowed the industry to keep us there. It's up to us to change that notion, demand better, create transparency to the risk we have, framed in 3 ways, like I always did at Intel and like I still do. There's risk to the business, there's risk to my customers, and then there's the societal risk. Again, think of the Pinto. Are we framing risk choices for our organizations in 3 ways? Or are we looking at it like Lee Iacocca did and Ford and just framing it in terms of risk to myself, risk to my business, risk to my financials versus risk to my customer or the societal risk I'm creating? And privacy needs to be included as well. How many of you have responsibility for privacy? A few people. Actually, that's really good. A few years ago when I'd asked that question, almost no security person would raise their hand. You know, I've always thought of security, again, as this design thing. In a lot of organizations, privacy is owned by legal, right? So it's structurally separated. And when you structurally separate things, you, again, drive different behaviors, different choices. And I've seen a lot, not only for organizations I've run, but other peers that I've interacted with, that again, they're opposing forces. And it's a security versus privacy, right? Like control versus speed, versus a how do I achieve both? How do I design for both? Again, I'm not saying you don't need to make trade-offs at some point, but it's a design issue, it's an architectural issue. And I think we can achieve security and privacy. I've always thought of security and privacy like two magnets. Turned one way, they're perfectly binding, right? Because you need good security to have privacy. But security, if it doesn't understand privacy, the nuances, the data limitations, it's like taking that magnet and turning it. And if privacy stays too caught up in the academic or legal frameworks, but really not understanding the practicality of the technology or the practicality of some of the other risk issues, it's like turning that other magnet. What happens when you turn magnets against each other? They repel each other, and you have a polarization between security and privacy. I think we have a lot of polarity between them. And again, that's a design issue. That's a structural issue. It's up to us to cross that chasm and fix it. Now, a little bit of a crude picture. For the guys in here, they'll know this is not privacy by design. Now, this is a Photoshop picture, but a real story. I was doing the ISSA conference in Dublin, Ireland in November of last year, and I went into a bathroom, and there was actually a bathroom designed this way. This is not privacy by design. Madeleine Albright, when she was Secretary of State for the United States in the late 90s when the crises were going on in Rwanda and Bosnia, she gave a talk in Sweden and coined an item called the doability doctrine. The essence of it was where our interests are clear and our values are at stake and we can make a difference, we must act and we must lead. We have to have the equivalent of a doability doctrine in the security industry. We can't accept compromise. It is a values issue. It is a societal responsibility besides a fiduciary accountability to our companies and our organizations. We can make a difference if we frame these things the right way and demand more of ourselves, more of the security industry. If we put those business outcomes out there and say, how do I create a demonstrable and sustainable bend in the curve of risk? How do I lower and flatten my total cost of controls? Because throwing money at the problem hasn't necessarily solved it. And I'm not saying that we don't, in some cases, need to spend more money. But when you go talk to a CFO and say, I need more, eventually they're going to get tired of it. How about we treat the CFO like a venture capitalist and say, I need this investment, and I'm going to deliver these 3 business outcomes to you. Here's how I'm going to reduce the risk. Here's how long-term I'm going to lower and flatten my total cost of controls. And here's how I'm going to remove the control friction on the other organization so they can achieve their missions and their objectives faster. You do that, you'll get an investment to transform what you're doing and how you're doing it. Last quote here. Muhammad Ali had a quote that I like, but the essence of it is impossible is nothing, impossible is a dare. But let me read you the details. Impossible is just a big word thrown around by small men who find it easier to live in the world they've been given rather than explore the power to change it. Impossible is not a fact. Impossible is an opinion. Impossible is not a declaration. Impossible is a dare. Impossible is potential. Impossible is temporary. Impossible is nothing. Don't accept compromise. Don't think it's impossible to do something different. If we all go out of here today with a mindset and a mindset of possibility and framing our choices for ourselves and our organizations, I think we can have a dramatic effect on the world, let alone our organizations. Thank you.